Lunar warnings. Commander Jack Walters squinted against the intense glare of the sun reflecting off the lunar surface, his helmet's visor dampening the brightness to an eerie glow. Here, on the moon's surface, silence enveloped everything, more oppressive than he could have imagined back in NASA's tightly controlled simulations. His breath echoed inside his helmet, merging with the slight hum of oxygen, a sound that reminded him just how precarious this whole endeavour was. And yet something had caught his attention, a flash in the lunar dust, a reflection where there should be none. He lifted his hand, signalling to the rest of the team. The slight flicker remained, half buried in the dust at the edge of the Mare Imbrium crater, right at the boundary where their mapped route ended. "Walters to Houston. We're seeing something unexpected," he spoke, his voice tight. But he didn't wait for a response. He moved forward, his steps cautious, every movement practiced, but now weighted with something else, curiosity and dread. As he reached the source of the glint, his breath hitched. His gloved hand brushed away layers of lunar dust, revealing a smooth metallic surface. Unlike the weathered lunar module, this material was untouched by corrosion, with a strange sheen that hinted at something far older. The voice of Dr. Karen Cho crackled in his ear. "Commander, what is it?" "Looks like wreckage," Walters replied slowly. He brushed more dust away, and the sleek, almost mirror-like surface stretched beneath his hand. His training told him this should be impossible. "This metal, it's not in our catalogue of materials. Nothing we know would hold up like this, not under these conditions." A gloved hand appeared next to his, brushing the dust carefully. Dr. Cho crouched beside him, and her voice took on an edge of skepticism. "How long do you think this has been here?" "No idea," he replied, but his mind was racing, tracing through possibilities. Apollo had combed these areas meticulously. For this to have been missed, it was practically impossible. Together, Walters and Cho uncovered more of the wreckage, and a few feet away, a distinct shape began to emerge from the dust. It was unmistakably a spacecraft, partially embedded in the lunar rock, its dark, angular design wholly unfamiliar. And then, as he cleared away the last layer of dust, he saw them. Figures, bodies, or what remained of them, sitting inside the wreckage, dressed in astronaut-like suits. They were positioned as if frozen in place, skeletal forms lined up, each facing a small screen embedded in the lunar rock before them, like worshippers before an altar. Walters swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. These skeletal figures weren't just random remains. They seemed posed with purpose, their empty sockets trained on the darkened screen. Cho's voice, normally calm, was strained. "My God, this changes everything." Their suits bore symbols that resembled no earthly language. Walters reached for the camera on his belt, documenting each detail, the bones rigid and fragile inside the alien suits. But something more, something intangible lingered in the scene. A warning, he thought, an ancient reminder of mortality. Yet these figures seemed preserved as if time had barely touched them. "Houston, we've got what appear to be humanoid remains," Walters said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's some kind of screen here, embedded into the rock. Unknown origin, unknown material." For a moment there was only static, and he could almost imagine the stunned silence on the other end. Then Houston's voice returned, clipped and cautious. "Copy that, Commander. Proceed with extreme caution." He stepped closer, his fingers hovering over the screen. Cho grabbed his arm, her voice sharp. "Jack, wait. We have no idea what that thing is." He hesitated, his gaze flicking from her face to the empty eye sockets of the figures before him. "It's already been activated," he murmured, almost to himself. and with that he pressed his glove against the cold surface. A crackle of static filled his headset, and the screen before him flickered to life. Walters froze as the images played before his eyes, a disturbing collage of sights and sounds that seemed both familiar and alien. There were distorted faces, half-formed and shifting like they were melting and reforming, explosions followed by the image of a blue and green planet, Earth. Walters recognized it immediately, but this was a vision of Earth in turmoil, consumed by fire, shrouded in smoke. Then came a voice, deep, rhythmic, and speaking in a language he couldn't comprehend. The sound wove through his headset, faintly distorted, the guttural syllables carrying a weight that felt ancient, almost primordial. It pulsed in a loop, a chant or warning, its repetition both haunting and mesmerizing. The crew members backed away, watching, transfixed. Walters felt his pulse hammering in his chest as the voice filled his ears, mixing with static, the syllables looping like a dark mantra, an unbreakable rhythm. Cho stared at him, her own shock mirrored in his visor. "It's a transmission, Jack. It's broadcasting something." Walters knew they needed to document every second of it. He ordered the crew to record the audio and visuals, but even as he spoke, his mind struggled to make sense of the implications. An alien transmission, pre-recorded maybe, he muttered, his voice cracking. But why Earth? Why show us Earth in chaos? The sight of the skeletal figures gazing at the screen gnawed at him. Were they warning future travellers, or had they left a record of something they had already witnessed? His voice cut through the silence. "This doesn't feel like a greeting. It feels like a message for whoever found them." They exchanged tense glances, each aware of NASA's eyes and ears on them, monitoring every word. They kept their theories guarded, at least for now. Walters sensed that whatever this was, it wasn't meant for open discussion. And then, in the final moments of the transmission, the screen showed Earth one last time. But this time, there was a difference. Fire and smoke shrouded the continents. Cities were engulfed in darkness, and a single guttural syllable resonated through their radios, spoken with chilling clarity. The voice, low and resonant, seemed to whisper directly to them. Silence followed. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Walters felt the weight of the discovery settle on his shoulders, a burden he hadn't anticipated. As they prepared to leave, a dark thought wormed its way into his mind. Whatever those beings had tried to communicate, they were carrying its legacy back to Earth, whether they understood it or not. Back on Earth, the transmission from the moon arrived under the highest classification. NASA assembled a top-tier team of experts, from linguists to historians, to decode the ancient message. Leading the decryption effort was Dr. Lisa Moreno, a linguist with a mind sharp as a blade and a haunted past. Raised under a regime known for its repression and secrecy, she had seen firsthand the dark consequences of unchecked power and control. This mission wasn't just another assignment for her. It was a rare chance to uncover a truth that might resonate far beyond science. From the first listen, the transmission's cadence unnerved her, rhythmic, yet alien. She couldn't shake the strange sense that it was speaking to her in ways deeper than language. It wasn't simply an audio clip, it felt like a presence in the room, hovering in the stillness, pressing down on her with its haunting authority. For days, Lisa and her team dissected the audio, isolating patterns, tones, and symbols embedded in the recording. They captured fragments, words that hinted at power and decay, imbalance, falling cycle, consumption. As they worked, their growing understanding of the message painted a disturbing picture of the civilization that had left it behind. Slowly they began to realize this was no ordinary transmission. It was a cautionary tale. "Falling cycle," Lisa repeated aloud, her voice hollow with recognition. She glanced around the sterile laboratory, the low hum of machinery and the shuffle of scientists and assistants filling the room. She saw it, the image of a society at the height of its power, toppling under the weight of its own self-destructive choices. Her thoughts raced, and that familiar surge of unease prickled her skin. The message hinted at corruption, cycles of control and decay, ideas that felt unsettlingly relevant. The more she listened, the stronger her pull to the message grew, almost magnetic. She began experiencing disturbing dreams, scenes of societies crumbling into dust, empires engulfed in flames. In these dreams, shadowed figures loomed in the background, echoing the guttural phrases from the transmission. "Do not repeat. Cycles return. Silence is the beginning of the end." The visions grew more vivid each night, as if the message had seeped into her mind, its warning pulsating in her blood. Lisa wasn't alone. Her colleagues on the project reported similar symptoms: headaches, anxiety, even faint echoes of voices in the stillness. Dr. Raj Patel, a lead scientist with close ties to powerful government circles, dismissed the symptoms as stress, perhaps psychosomatic. But for Lisa, the transmission felt as if it were reaching through time itself, stirring old, dormant fears and urging them to heed its warning. Patel approached her one evening after they'd made another breakthrough. "These fragments are interesting, Lisa," he said, leaning against the door frame with his usual authoritative air. "But we need to be cautious. It's easy to read too much into an ancient warning." Lisa stiffened. "With respect, Dr. Patel, we're not just deciphering fragments. This message speaks about power imbalances, about societies collapsing under their own weight. Does any of this feel familiar?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Don't get too close to this, Lisa. We have a responsibility here. NASA won't let this go public if it's going to incite fear or chaos." "Fear?" she echoed, her voice sharp. "This message is a warning, a plea not to make the same mistakes. Or it's a piece of history we don't fully understand. Let's not turn it into something it isn't." His tone was final, dismissive, but the way his eyes darted suggested that he felt it too. The unease, the discomfort that came with proximity to hidden knowledge. Over the following days, the team pushed forward, decoding larger sections of the transmission. The fragments grew into coherent sentences, each one layering their vision of the ancient society's downfall. A ruling class driven by exploitation, oppression spread like poison, silencing dissent, cycles of ruin. Lisa's nights grew restless. She would lie awake, hearing the transmission's tones echo in her mind, seeing the faces of the skeletal figures from the moon. The feeling of dread became a presence in itself, lurking behind every translated word. Her instincts told her this message was more than a caution. It was a story, a fate laid bare for them to witness. And the effects on her team were only intensifying. Patel, once dismissive, now showed signs of strain, his normally calm demeanor eroded by irritability and fatigue. Several members of the team reported shared dreams, visions of Earth in turmoil, with governments crumbling and society on the brink of collapse. Some claimed to hear voices, low and rhythmic, echoing the transmission. It was as if the message wasn't just a recording, it was alive, infecting them, pressing its purpose into their minds. In a quiet meeting room late one evening, Lisa gathered her closest colleagues, scientists she trusted beyond the formalities of the project. "We can't keep this buried," she whispered, glancing around the dimly lit room. "This transmission is telling us about a cycle, a cycle that destroyed them, and one that might destroy us if we ignore it. Patel, who had insisted on attending despite his reservations, shook his head. If this goes public, do you have any idea what kind of reaction it will cause? Rumours are already circulating, the public will panic, and there are those who'll use this for their own agendas. This isn't just about science anymore, Lisa. It's about control. It's about truth, she countered. Do we want to be responsible for hiding the truth when it might help us avoid the same mistakes? She was met with silence, but their faces said enough. They knew she was right. Yet, the consequences of releasing the message were staggering. The government had already stationed officials around the project, monitoring every word. A leak would come with severe consequences, threats hinted at, but understood by all. Lisa felt the weight of her decision mounting. The transmission's warning was clear. Silence is the beginning of the end. If she stayed silent, would they be complicit in dooming their society to repeat history? Or could revealing it spark the very chaos they were trying to avoid? A new fragment was translated, sealing her decision. Cycles return to dust. Silence ensures the fall. The phrase echoed in her mind, reinforcing the truth she had sensed from the beginning. This wasn't just a relic of a long-lost civilization. This was a desperate plea across time, meant for them, directed at humanity with a simple, unignorable urgency. Her decision was clear now. She had to release the translation, had to warn the world. In the darkness of her office, she drafted a message to an old friend in the media, attaching a translated portion of the transmission. Her hands trembled as she hit send, knowing the consequences would be immediate and intense. But as she leaned back in her chair, a new dread settled in. She had broken the silence, yes, but the cycle was still there, waiting in the shadows, coiling tighter. Lisa knew her decision would change everything. The transmission, now a part of her own reality, weighed on her like a silent companion. She'd spent hours going over the phrases, the tones, the fragmented scenes of decay and ruin, and she couldn't ignore what was spelled out so clearly. Power imbalances, silence, collapse. She'd seen those forces before, in her own family's history, in the cracks forming beneath society's polished surface. It wasn't a relic from a long-gone civilization. It was a message meant for the world now. That night she copied the full translation onto an encrypted drive, her pulse racing. She looked over her shoulder, half expecting a government official to step out from the shadows. She composed an email to a trusted contact in the media, attaching the partial translation with a simple message. The world needs to see this. Within hours, the leak was everywhere. News outlets splashed the cryptic phrases across their broadcasts. Imbalance, consumption, cycles return. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories, anger, and demands for transparency. The words lunar warnings trended worldwide, and people poured into the streets, protesting, chanting. A society that had long ago become comfortable with secrets and silent compliance now demanded answers. Lisa watched in silence from her apartment, exhausted but resolute. She knew the message would spark chaos, but even she hadn't expected the frenzy that followed. Governments around the globe responded with unease, a palpable fear that this ancient warning struck too close to their own power structures. It was clear the message wasn't just a curiosity, it was a threat. In response, NASA made a public statement confirming the authenticity of the translation. Under mounting pressure, they released the full message in a tightly controlled press briefing. Lisa's fingers tightened as she watched the broadcast, the words echoing with chilling clarity. Our end came from within. A ruling class, blind to the cries of its people, exploited resources, silenced dissent, and clung to power even as the world turned to ash. The cycle must break, or you too will fall to dust. As the broadcast ended, silence swept over the room, settling like a heavy mist. Lisa felt a jolt of validation, knowing that the truth was out there now, untethered and free. But the look on the officials' faces was something darker, a sense of betrayal. To them, she had gone too far. She had ignited a spark they could no longer control. Protests escalated. Governments scrambled, some trying to reassure their citizens, others doubling down on suppressing the message. Some nations, fearful of the implications, enacted swift reforms in an attempt to address inequality and corruption. Others dismissed the transmission as ancient fear-mongering, refusing to let it alter their grip on power. The world found itself caught between those who saw the warning as a call to action and those who viewed it as a threat to stability. As days turned into weeks, Lisa faced backlash. Her superiors reprimanded her, her clearance revoked, her career in ruins. She knew the risks, had seen the costs, but she stood firm. The transmission had been the truth the world needed. Still, doubts gnawed at her. Had she saved humanity, or set it on a path toward chaos? 6 months passed, and the effects rippled across society. Riots, reform movements, and sweeping legislative changes erupted worldwide. Corporations fell under scrutiny, powerful figures were publicly denounced, and a groundswell of new leaders emerged, promising a fairer system. Yet, for all the upheaval, Lisa remained haunted by a sense of incompleteness. The message had been heard, yes, but had it truly been understood? Would the world heed it? Or was this merely a brief, fiery spark before falling back into darkness? A year later, Jack Walters floated in silence aboard the International Space Station, orbiting above the world that now bore the scars of upheaval and uncertainty. He gazed out at the moon where he'd uncovered the first clue to the ancient warning. From this distance, Earth looked peaceful, even idyllic. But he knew the truth was far more complicated. Humanity was teetering on the edge. For every hopeful movement that sought to reform and heal, there were pockets of resistance, remnants of the old guard, grasping to maintain control. Jack, who had once held his skepticism close, felt an odd, reluctant optimism. Maybe this time, he thought, maybe the cycle could break. As he continued his silent vigil, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in this experience, that whatever civilization had left that message on the moon was watching too, across the unfathomable chasm of time. He closed his eyes, letting the silence fill him, the word hope echoing in his mind like a fragile but steady drumbeat. Back on Earth, in a shadowy, secured government room, a high-ranking official sat under fluorescent lights, studying the original untranslated transmission. Unlike the public version, this one contained an additional line that had been deliberately concealed from the team and from the world. With a casual flick of his wrist, the official highlighted the final passage, a phrase tucked into the end of the transmission. This warning ensures the cycle continues. He smirked, closing the file. The message hadn't been a simple cautionary tale. It was a design, a structure meant to perpetuate fear and compliance, to control rather than liberate. This ancient civilization, it seemed, hadn't just fallen. They had engineered their own downfall into a haunting legend, a tale meant to echo through time, seeding panic and obedience in those who found it. The official leaned back, content in his knowledge. Humanity's course wouldn't change. It was hardwired, bound to repeat in a loop as ancient as the stars.